Básanos, a tortured word in the Bible. After a long hiatus, I'm finally back. I would like to start by focusing on the Greek word básanos and why it's so important to understand the true meaning behind this word and the very profound theological implications of this understanding. Some time ago, I ran into a research paper on the Greek word básanos published by classics professor Michael Gagarin of the University of Texas back in the 90s. What really got my attention is Dr. Gagarin was investigating ancient legal systems and wasn't motivated by biblical theology at all, making him a very impartial researcher on this matter. Dr. Gagarin remarks, "The word básanos originally means a touchstone to test gold, and then any test to determine the genuineness of someone or something. In the orators, it sometimes retains a simple sense of a test, but more often designates a means of confirming information by an interrogation, normally, but not always, accompanied by the infliction of physical pain. Básanos can also refer to the evidence that results from such interrogation." Dr. Gagarin also notes that básanos is never used to denote punishment by torture. Básanos only denotes interrogation, and that is so significant because this word is commonly and yet falsely associated with the doctrine of endless punishment. But they're not being punished, much less endlessly. This understanding of básanos was clearly understood by lexicographers even back in the 19th century. In Green's Greek lexicon we read, "Básanos, to apply the lapis luteus or touchstone, to examine, scrutinize, try, either by words or torture." Synonyms for básanos would include confronted, examined, scrutinized, tested, challenged. And if you want to focus on the suffering aspect of básanos, you could say scourged or flogged, and that might give you some sense of what's going on. But the translation tormented is so vague and deceptive, it leaves the reader completely blinded to the actual meaning of these passages. It is such a disservice to the reader. Yes, sometimes, but not always, torment is associated with básanos. But that is not the actual meaning of the word. This false translation of básanos as torment is a major pillar for the false doctrine of endless punishment. But again, this word never denotes punishment, much less endless punishment. So I'm knocking that pillar down right now. The Latin theologians did not want to translate básanos correctly because correct translations of this word reveals the following. Básanos is 1. Temporary. 2. It is a search for the truth. 3. There's a purpose behind it, namely the restoration of the sinner. In short, the actual meaning of básanos destroyed their pet doctrine, so they buried it. But they were correct that it does infer suffering in some sense. Based on the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, it is clear to me that those undergoing this kind of interrogation by God are undergoing emotional pain of some kind, as Dr. Gagarin notes, commonly but not always associated with suffering. He cried out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus, that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame." So in light of that, we need to remember Lamentations 3:31-33. "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever. Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love, for he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." Therefore, básanos, biblically speaking, indicates some kind of ordeal or confrontation intended to bring someone to the truth. Theologically, this is very profound because God already knows the truth. This confrontation is because the sinner needs to face the truth. God does this for our benefit. As readers of the New Testament, we are obligated to understand this biblical concept of básanos should be understood in simile and not rendered obscurely simply as torment, as doing so leaves the reader completely blind to what is actually going on in these passages. God isn't literally flogging or scourging anyone, but rather we need to understand that being drawn to the truth in this manner is by its very nature unavoidably a painful process. Furthermore, this example in Revelation 20:10 is specifically for the devil, the beast, and the false prophet who have caused untold human suffering. It's not surprising they are receiving some rough handling by God. They gave God no other choice. They are reaping what they have sown. Just as Paul warns, don't be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. And notice that that idea is not really about punishment. It's just saying if you do this, this is going to happen. And it's just inevitable. Sin has consequences. When I first started this channel, my understanding of básanos was limited, albeit better than the Latin translators, but at the time I didn't have Dr. Gagarin's work to lean on. I wish I could soften these passages related to básanos in the afterlife, but I just can't. I do believe, based on the preponderance of the evidence, it should be commonly translated as interrogation and allow exactly that harsh imagery to be drawn out. Or the aforementioned synonyms could also work, but I want to be careful not to do what the Latin translators did in reverse and deceptively over-soften these passages. There's some very important theology behind básanos that we need to understand. As Dr. Gagarin notes, básanos is never related to punishment, but is always a test for the truth, as in interrogation, commonly but not always associated with suffering. Básanos actually indicates bringing someone to the truth. It indicates restoration. Therefore, I now believe Revelation 20:10 should be translated as follows. The devil who deceived them was thrown into the crucible, where the beast and the false prophet are also. They will be interrogated day and night in the great age of ages. Revelation 20:10. Although I have published my references related to this work elsewhere, I would like to do an upcoming video also very focused on this verse and defending why this is the correct translation and explaining exactly why it is the correct translation. Interrogated day and night in the great age of ages sounds harsh indeed. John is not diluting this, and neither will I. Although not senseless torture, we need to understand it's not pleasant either. We also need to understand básanos in its biblical context. That they are interrogated day and night merely implies continuity of action, not senseless torture without any rest or some idea like that. From the book of Joshua, we read, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written therein." As Christian believers, we are to meditate on God's word day and night as well. A kind of self-interrogation and in continuity of action. James explains, "For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man looking at his natural face in a mirror, for he sees himself and goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of man he was. But he who looks into the perfect law of freedom and continues, not being a hearer who forgets, but a doer of the work, this man will be blessed in what he does." So básanos is actually a very contextually dependent word, and this entire definition that Dr. Gagarin gives us would have come to their mind every time they would see this word, and they would have to apply it to the context of the passage. And so this makes it kind of difficult to translate this word into English, and the translations we have where they just want to stamp torment on it everywhere are ridiculous. I mean, they're really, they're actually laughable. But to give you an idea, let's look at some translations, what I believe how they should be translated. So Matthew 8:6, "Lord, my servant lies in the house paralyzed, scourged with fear." Matthew 8:29, "Behold, they cried out, saying, 'What do we have to do with you, Jesus, Son of God? Have you come here to interrogate us before the time?' Matthew 14:24, "But the boat was now in the middle of the sea, scourged by the waves, challenging the integrity of the boat, for the wind was contrary." And so this is sort of a difficult passage because I think that entire concept would have been applied to it in their mind when they were reading the passage. And so in English, if we want a thought-for-thought translation, we probably do need to translate it something like that. Mark 6:48, Seeing them confronted by a contrary wind as they were rowing about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. Revelation 11:10. Those who dwell on the earth rejoice over them and will be glad. They will give gifts to one another because these two prophets confronted those who dwell on the earth. Luke 16:23. In Hades he lifted up his eyes, beginning in his interrogation, and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his bosom. Revelation 9:5. They were given power not to kill them, but to interrogate them for 5 months. Their interrogation was like the scourging of a scorpion, the flagrum, when it strikes a person. Now, in this context, a scorpion is being used as a euphemism for a Roman flagrum, which isn't unique to Rome. We read this in 1 Kings chapter 12, that King Rehoboam decides that he's going to scourge his disgruntled people with a scorpion, a flagrum, and that was the end of the united kingdom of Israel. They flew apart and have never been reunited since then. But this is very interesting because the Apostle John is very specifically drawing out this imagery of a nation undergoing an interrogation by the flagrum in simile, and this is parallel to what happened to Christ under Pontius Pilate, who was scourged by a flagrum. And so if this word básanos strongly meant that, then John wouldn't need to draw that out. You would just know that by reading it, right? And so I do find that interesting. Nowhere else in the New Testament is this specific imagery being drawn out related to básanos. So if básanos always just meant scourging by flagrum, then John wouldn't need to force that understanding in Revelation 9:5, but he does. So I hope you can now see how very contextually dependent this Greek word básanos is, and how very important it is to understand this word in its correct context. That God is drawing sinners to the truth, not because God needs to know the truth, but because us sinners need to face the truth. God takes no pleasure in the suffering of anyone. He does this for the sake of the sinner. And I'd like to conclude this message with a quote from Plato using the word básanos. In addition, in all our discussions, we must fit the individual to the species, both questioning and refuting those things that have not been nobly spoken. This rightly becomes the first and finest touchstone, básanos, for human beings, whereas all those who are not genuine but pretend to be so involve everyone in the vainest labor of all. In that same way, I believe we need to question and refute translations of the Bible by putting them to the touchstone, because Bible translations that are not genuine but pretend to be so involve everyone in the vainest labor of all. Yes, básanos indicates a painful process, but it is a process. Translating básanos merely as tormented is highly deceptive, actually, because it leaves the reader completely blind to the fact that básanos is always a search for the truth or genuineness of someone or something. These passages should be translated as interrogation, and I hope some major Bible publisher will have the courage and integrity to do so. You have Dr. Gagarin's work on this topic as your authority. He empirically shows these passages should and must be translated as interrogation and not blindside the reader with endless, meaningless torment, it's just nonsense. And I'll say it again. You don't need to believe in the doctrine of universal restoration to be a Christian. You only need to believe that Jesus Christ is your Savior to be a Christian. But we do need accurate Bible translations, because without it, our eschatology, soteriology, or whateverology will always be misinformed. Calvinism and Arminianism are both hopelessly trying to reconcile the false doctrine of eternal punishment. There's not even punishment going on here. There's interrogation going on, which is interesting. So, at this channel, I've been teaching the ancient Christian doctrine of the apokatastasis, or the doctrine of universal restoration, which is actually not universal salvation. It's actually universal restoration for those who are not saved. And that may sound like semantics to some people, but it probably isn't semantics for those who are going through this interrogation, right? But the doctrine of universal restoration was always the correct doctrine, and it was embraced by some of the most highly regarded theologians of the Christian faith. This is not some crazy New Age doctrine, which I hear a lot of Christians say, this is a New Age doctrine. This is an ancient doctrine. This is what the earliest Christians believed, believe it or not. And it has never disappeared from the faith. It's always been with us. My initial education on this topic was informed by scholars and theologians writing in the 1800s: John Wesley Hanson, Edward Beecher, John Bovey Dodds, Otis Skinner, Frederick Farrar, Thomas Thayer, Hosea Ballou. The latter was almost 200 years ago, clearly understanding this ancient doctrine 200 years ago. Modern scholars like Dr. Eloria Ramelli, David Bentley Hart, Robin Perry have written extensively about this with overwhelming evidence for the correctness of this doctrine, or at least overwhelming evidence that this was a view held by early Christians. And actually, all through Christian history, there have been people who understood this. So when we correct these incorrect Bible translations, we can see what the earliest Christians could see. The concept of endless punishment is nowhere in the text. Not to mention, if the apostles and prophets were trying to teach endless punishment, they were most certainly not being transparent about that idea at all. Watch in their own words.